Welcome to the Unit 2 Content Overview recording. Remember, these are not specifically going to discuss every individual concept in this unit, but rather give you an overview of what you should be expecting to learn from this unit and how to study for the exams. So for this unit, we're going to do carbohydrates, fluids, and electrolytes. And if you can remember from your Unit 1, we have 6 elements that are crucial for health, especially when it comes to diet. And if you can't remember, those 6 elements are protein, carbs, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. Okay. And this week we're going to focus primarily on the carbohydrates, as they are often referred to the energy-rich nutrients in our diet that is a staple to life. We're going to explore not only what they are, but the chemistry of them, how they're classified, how they relate to fiber, and fiber is a key component as well. And then we're going to look at carbohydrates and how they're stored in the body. I also said that water was one of our essential elements for health. We're going to talk about water all the way through this course. This week we're going to look at fluids and electrolytes in general, as well as mechanisms that have an effect on our nutritional status. So for this unit, we have 3 outcomes. The first is to discuss the carbohydrates and look at their relationship within health promotion and wellness. That doesn't seem like a very big outcome, but if you look at the chapter and you see all the different components related to carbohydrates, how they relate to energy, how they relate to fiber, that's a big outcome. So please pay close attention to that chapter. We're going to look at fluids and electrolytes. We're going to look at their relationship with health promotion and wellness. And then we're going to look at critical functions of water in health and wellness. So as we go through these next few slides, pay attention to these unit outcomes and pay attention to those in your textbook as well. And you're going to see in our discussions that we really focus on these outcomes and the content that goes along with them. Your reading assignments this week include 3 chapters. All of Chapter 4, which covers our carbohydrates. In Chapter 8, which goes over water and minerals, for this unit you want to focus on pages 129 to 134, and then 144 to 146. In Chapter 9, which goes over energy, weight, and fitness, I want you to focus strictly on pages 166 to 186. All right, let's start with Chapter 4, which again goes over carbohydrates. And this is a relatively information-packed chapter, so please read it carefully. But a great place to start with any chapter, of course, is the learning objectives. So by the time you get done reading this chapter, you should be able to identify the simple carbohydrates and what their components are. You should be able to explain the different types of complex carbohydrates, list the dietary recommendations, and if you remember back from Unit 1, we talked about the DRI and the AMDR for carbohydrates, discuss the functions of carbohydrates as an energy source and how they relate to dietary fiber. Then we want you to be able to describe the differences and the health benefits of soluble and insoluble fiber, and then compare the nutrient content of refined versus unrefined grains. And if you look at the picture, you'll see carbohydrates are a large portion of our diet. Not just breads and pastas, but also fruits and some vegetables have carbohydrates. So this is a very important chapter for you to pay attention to. Let's start by thinking about what a carbohydrate actually does in the body. A carbohydrate actually gives the body energy. In fact, they are the best source of fuel for the body, which is why if you've ever seen a sports team or been on a sports team, you'll notice that right before a game, they'll actually eat a lot of pasta. That pasta breaks down into energy, which gives them a huge advantage when they begin to play. They get this boost of energy. But did you also know that carbohydrates also help to digest protein and fat? So they do serve more than one function in our body. Okay, let's look at objective 1. We said objective 1 for this chapter was to identify the simple carbohydrates and their components. So let's start off with what is a simple carbohydrate. If you look at the picture to the right, you'll see that we see a simple carbohydrate is either a monosaccharide or a disaccharide. A monosaccharide meaning there's only one mono, saccharide meaning sugar, so a single sugar molecule. And what a monosaccharide would be something like glucose, fructose, galactose, okay? A disaccharide, di meaning two, saccharide meaning sugar, would be two sugar molecules linked together. Okay, so we're talking like maltose, sucrose, lactose. Some examples of simple carbohydrates would be foods like milk, fruits, vegetables, cake, candy, any other refined sugar is a simple sugar. It does provide energy, but it lacks vitamins, minerals, and fiber. Objective 2 moves us on to complex carbohydrates. So we're going to explain the different types of complex carbohydrates. You remember with the simple carbohydrates, we were talking about the monosaccharides and the disaccharides. When we talk about the complex carbohydrates, we're talking about the polysaccharides. Poly meaning many, saccharide meaning sugar. So we're looking at many sugar molecules linked together. Examples are starch, glucose, and cellulose, which might also be known as fiber. So for this chapter, we're going to look at starch and fiber. When we talked about the simple carbohydrates, we talked about the sugars and the easily broken down carbohydrates. And we talk about, in the chapter, we talk about a lot of health problems related to eating too many of our simple carbohydrates. On the other hand, when we talk about our complex carbohydrates, these carbohydrates provide vitamins, minerals, and fiber. They're found in foods such as breads, legumes, which are your beans, rice, pasta, certain starchy vegetables. All of these contain complex carbohydrates. And when we talk about complex carbohydrates, we do focus more on the health effects. Again, everything in moderation. But when you're eating complex carbohydrates versus simple carbohydrates, we're talking about health effects like eating high fiber foods that help you have weight control. Fiber especially helps with constipation, and we'll talk about that in another discussion with one of our patients as well. But we know fiber helps with constipation. Diverticular disease, which we'll link into one of your med-surg courses when you talk about diverticulosis or diverticulitis. That's a disease of the large intestine. Fiber helps with that. Eating enough dietary fiber can also reduce the risk of colon cancer, so it does help with cancer. Also, if we eat more fiber, we tend to eat less fat because foods containing fiber are bulkier. They seem to fill us up a lot quicker. So by decreasing our fat intake, we help with cancer. We can also help them with heart disease because by decreasing our fat intake and increasing our fiber, we can lower our dietary cholesterol and lipid levels. Again, we'll talk about that some more in a future chapter. And in this chapter, we talked about Hannah, who was pre-diabetic or was going to could possibly become diabetic because of her diet. Dietary fiber helps people with diabetes stabilize blood glucose levels. So again, a lot of benefits to eating those complex carbohydrates. But remember, everything in moderation. Objective 3 for Chapter 4, we're going to list the dietary recommendations for the carbohydrates. So remember back to Unit 1, we talked about the DRI, or the Dietary Reference Intake. Now we're going to apply it to carbs. The DRI for carbs is 130 grams per day, and that's based on an adult between the ages of 19 to 30 years old. The acceptable macronutrient distribution range, or the AMDR, for carbohydrates is between 45 to 65% of your kilocalorie intake per day. But remember, 45 to 65% doesn't mean we want to have a lot of simple carbs. We want those to be primarily complex carbohydrates. So not all carbohydrates are bad, like we discussed in our discussion. We do need carbohydrates. In fact, we need 45 to 65% of our total kilocalorie intake per day as carbohydrates. But what we want to do is emphasize eating a plant-based diet. That consists of fruits, vegetables, cooked dried beans and peas, whole grains, and seeds. By emphasizing this type of diet, for example, 2 cups of fruit, 2.5 cups of vegetables, and 6 ounces of grains, things like breads, cereal, rice, and pasta, but they should be whole grains. That's the best way that we can help reduce the risk of chronic diseases when it comes to dietary modifications. And then finally, we can't forget about our fiber, which again is a type of carbohydrate, but fiber has its own recommendations, and an adequate intake of dietary fiber is between 25 to 38 grams per day. This does depend on age and gender. So for example, an adult woman should have somewhere between 20 to 35 per day, with a male having slightly more. Objective 4 wants us to discuss the functions of carbohydrates as a source of energy and dietary fiber. So if you remember, carbohydrates are broken down, and they're a source of energy to the body. What carbohydrates do is spares the protein in our body, and basically they're used as an energy source instead of the protein, so that the body is able to use the protein to maintain and repair body tissue instead of being used up as energy. And in a future chapter, we'll talk about protein and its importance. And then you really understand why it's important for us to have the carbohydrates for our body to use as energy versus moving into the protein. You've always probably heard that fat breaks down before muscle. Again, that goes back into carbs breaking down before protein. The carbohydrates are converted into glucose, which is the only source of energy that the brain can use. So we've got to have carbohydrates for brain function. And if you look in your book, there's a great explanation of what happens when those carbs are converted into glucose and how that really functions in the body. Now, some carbohydrates are high in fiber, which we talked about before will help prevent constipation and lower the risk for certain diseases such as cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. So then what foods are we talking about when we talk about high fiber foods? Well, beans, we mentioned beans, whole grains, and that can be oats as well. So things like whole grain or whole oatmeal. Your instant oatmeal, not quite as much because it's broken down a little further, but oatmeal. A lot of your vegetables are high in fiber. Your fruits can be high in fiber, and that can include your dehydrated fruits like raisins. Nuts are high in fiber, and certain seeds like flax seed, chia seed, and there's also a table in your textbook that goes over some specific foods. So you want to make sure that you understand what the carbohydrates do, why we're getting the carbohydrates in our body for energy, and then also which ones not only function as carbohydrates and energy, but also function as dietary fiber. All right, so moving on to objective 5. Now we're going to look a little bit deeper into fiber. So we're going to describe the differences and the health benefits of soluble versus insoluble fiber. Okay, so we've already figured out that we need fiber, but there's 2 different kinds of it now. We're going to look at soluble versus insoluble. And I hope that you can use these pictures that I'm putting in this review to kind of help you study. I'm a very visual person, and I like things to be compared. So this is a great picture of the differences between soluble and insoluble. When we talk about soluble fiber, it really starts to slow digestion down. It assists the body in absorbing vital nutrients from the foods. It does dissolve in water in the large intestine, and it begins to form a gel. And what it does, it helps to lower total cholesterol levels. It helps to lower LDL cholesterol levels, or your low density lipoprotein levels, which we'll talk about in a future module. It also helps improve glycemic index in patients with diabetes. And if you read your chapter about how carbohydrates are broken down and used as energy, you recognize the term glycemic index. Okay, so some examples of foods that have soluble fiber, things like oat and rice bran, barley, peas, beans, Apple pulp, so if you're drinking apple juice that's been strained, we're not getting that soluble fiber. We need that pulp, okay? Citrus fruits with the pulp again, we want the pulp in there. Strawberries, any kind of berry, blueberries, blackberries, and then psyllium husk. And you'll see that primarily put into types of your fiber laxatives. On the other hand, insoluble fiber, that does not dissolve in water, okay, but it does help the movement of waste through the intestinal tract. So it acts like a bulk. You might see on commercials where there's fiber supplements to help you with constipation. You'll see some of them don't mix in and some of them do. That kind of goes with the soluble versus insoluble fiber. Now, insoluble fiber has been known to help decrease the risk of cardiovascular diseases. It has helped slow the progression of cardiovascular diseases, especially those that have high risk. Okay. It does help prevent constipation. This is more of the constipation side. Also helps in removing toxic waste in the colon. And there's a great website that you can go to for more information. But examples of foods that have insoluble fiber, things like wheat bran, whole grain, rice, flaxseed, nuts, popcorn, cabbage, and you can see the list goes on, as well as other fruits and vegetables that have skins on them. You'll see in the previous one we had beans, not really much with skins. Apple was the pulp we were looking for. Strawberries, no skin. The insoluble, we're talking about fruits and vegetables that have skins on them. So finally, objective 6. Let's look at the nutrient content of refined versus unrefined grains. When we talk about refined versus whole grains, unlike whole grains, the refined grains are missing parts of the kernel, which is why they're easier to digest. But consequently, they're missing many of the nutrients and the health benefits of whole grains. Unfortunately, about half of the grain intake should come from whole grains, but 85% to 90% of the grains found in the supermarkets are made from refined grains. When we talk about refined grains, because the bran and the germ are removed, you lose things like B vitamins, iron, and fiber. So that's why we want to stick with the whole grains. Sometimes with your refined grains, like if you look at bread, you'll see it'll say enriched. When that happens, the company's using a refined grain to make the product, but they're adding back in things like the B vitamins and iron. The problem is you still lose the fiber because you're losing that part of the kernel or the husk. Here's a quick summary of what we just talked about in all the previous slides. I'm not going to read them word for word, but I do recommend at this point that you pause this lecture so that you can read this summary in detail. You may continue on to the next part of the lecture after you've read this thoroughly. Now let's move on to Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is about water and minerals. For the purpose of this week, we're only going to cover pages 129 to 134 and 144 to 146. Let's first look at the functions of water. Okay. We can live several weeks without food, but we can survive only a few days without water or fluids. Although our bodies can store nutrients for fuel, like we talked about with our carbs, we do need a minimum intake of water. We need this for cell functions, and we also need it as a solution with which we can eliminate waste products through. This is how we make urine. So if you look at the picture, you can see there's so many things that water does in our body. First of all, our brain is 75% water. So when we get dehydrated, it's not unusual for us to become confused. And we'll talk about signs of dehydration a little bit later. Water transports nutrients and oxygen to the cells. It helps with breathing. It helps transform those nutrients into energy. It protects and it hydrates our organs. It helps the body to absorb nutrients. 75% of our muscles are comprised of water. Not only that, it's 92% of our blood. Water helps us regulate body temperature, helps eliminate toxins. It's 22% of our bones. It's also used to protect and lubricate the joints. So you can see there's really not any part of the body that's not affected somewhat by water. So it's a major component of our diet. This is a great diagram, and you can find it on page 132 of your book. It really shows the intake of fluids as it's balanced with our output. So we get in water through foods as well as liquids. So we'll talk about some foods in just a little bit that have water in them. But basically, we intake the fluid, it goes into the stomach, and then as it's digested and gets into the intestines, we know that our intestines, from Unit 1 we talked about, our intestines absorb fluid. The intestines then distribute the fluid to the lungs, to the skin, to the blood vessels, to the kidneys, and then on to the large intestines. But from there, we actually use fluid. So if you think about how the lungs use fluid or actually excrete fluid, if you're not sure how, get close to a window sometime and breathe. And you'll notice that you get condensation on the window. That's fluid. So again, we're actually losing fluid through our lungs. So as we breathe, we lose fluid. Okay. Obviously, when we sweat with our skin, our kidneys use it, and actually we excrete it through urine. And then, of course, in the intestines, even though we do absorb some fluid, we do need a little bit to be able to excrete feces. Again, it's not completely dry. So you'll listen, some of that fluid then is excreted through the large intestines. So again, we've got to take in as much, if not more, than what we put out so we can maintain a good balance. Okay, so you can see again, this is another good explanation of how important water is as far as body fluid compartments. If you remember from pathophysiology, or if you haven't taken pathophysiology yet, you'll hear the terms intracellular and extracellular. Intracellular meaning within the cells of the body, which is 65% of our body water. And then extracellular meaning outside the cells, which is 35% of our body water. And again, our total body weight with regards to water changes over the lifespan. So this chart shows you as a newborn, you're 75 to 80% body weight, which is water. As an adult male, you're 55 to 60% body weight of water, and then females 50 to 55%. So again, this changes based on age as well as gender. But either way, you can see we're a large component of water, which is why it's so important for you to take in enough water daily to sustain functions. So obviously the best way to get water is through drinking water and other liquids that contain water. Tea is also a great source. Anything that is liquid obviously has water in it. It's just the other components you have to be careful of. For example, soft drinks. They do have water in them, but because of the sugars and the caffeine and all the preservatives are not the best source of water. But if we're talking about just getting dietary sources of water, in addition to drinking, you can actually get water from your foods. And a lot of foods that are moist, such as your cucumbers, tomatoes, celery, grapefruit, lettuce, watermelon, watercress, hence the word water in the title, they're very high in water content. I mean, as far as up to 96% water. So when you're worried about becoming dehydrated, it does not always come down to drinking a lot of water by itself. You also can include water intake when it comes to your foods. When you get into med-surg, when we talk about kidney disease and we talk about fluid restrictions on patients, we also have to consider the foods that they're eating, not just the stuff that they're drinking, but the foods that they're eating because of the high content of water. So again, you can get water from a variety of places, not just drinking water. I do want to talk about fluid imbalances. While they're not a specific objective for this chapter, they are covered in the pages that we're reading for this module. So I do want to talk about a fluid imbalance, dehydration. And of course, dehydration would be considered a fluid volume deficit. And this is when we don't maintain a balance with our fluids. Either we don't take in enough, or we have diarrhea or vomiting or fever. We can have excessive loss of fluids, and we don't take in enough to maintain. So this is a very good table that talks about the signs and symptoms of dehydration, whether it's mild to moderate or severe. You'll notice that things like thirst, dry mouth, maybe you're not sweating, urine decreases. So please take a few moments to pause this video and read the signs of dehydration. In some cases, you're going to see, especially like in athletes, you may see them become uncoordinated. Remember, we talked about the brain being so highly concentrated with water. So make sure you pay attention to your patients and see if they're showing signs of dehydration. Probably one of the earliest signs is simply being with a dry mouth and thirst. So I do encourage you to pause for a few minutes and read this table for signs of dehydration. When you're ready, you can press play and move on. On the other hand, we can have fluid excess, and that's when we have too much fluid going in with failure to eliminate. This normally doesn't happen to a healthy person when all of the other body functions are functioning. For example, we just take in too much water and we're a otherwise healthy person, our body usually can eliminate it through natural processes. You have probably heard of some instances where there were drinking contests, water drinking contests, where people actually did take in too much fluid too quickly and the body couldn't eliminate it fast enough. But normally we don't get fluid volume excess unless we have an issue with, for example, our kidneys or our digestive processes. But if we do have a fluid volume excess, again, too much going in with failure to take it out, one of the first things you'll see is edema. And pitting edema, if you haven't had your health assessments, when you kind of press in and you can make an indentation in somebody's skin and the indentation doesn't immediately bounce back, we call that pitting edema, and there's various levels. Other things like changes in level of consciousness, headaches, we can have pulmonary congestion, again, too much fluid building up in the lungs. We can have tachycardia, we can have a bounding pulse, we can have anorexia, we can have nausea. There's a lot of things that can happen when we get too much fluid volume. In addition, we'll talk about sodium in just a minute, but as we add more water to our bodies, we're going to decrease concentrations of some of our electrolytes, for example, sodium. And then in addition, our hematocrit will be reduced because we have too much water diluting it. That will be something you'll talk about when you take the pathophysiology. But again, if our blood is composed of fluid primarily and we start diluting it, we're going to start running into some problems with hematocrit, osmolality, things like that. Pages 144 to 146 talk about electrolytes. While not directly linked to a specific chapter objective, I wanted to point these out because these kind of go in with our minerals and our vitamins. We'll talk about electrolytes. The first one is sodium, and you probably have talked about this in another course. We get it mostly with salt in our diet. So what does sodium actually do? If you look at the bottom, I have a small diagram for you. To put it very simply, salt helps us maintain fluid balance in the body, which helps with our blood pressure. It is important for the transmission of nerve impulses. It helps remove excess acidity of the cells, especially in the neurons. It does prevent muscle cramps, and it also helps with nutrient absorption. And that's just a simple way to put it. You'll probably learn a little bit more about that in your med surgery or pathophysiology course. But we do know that sodium is important in the diet. So we go into the recommended intake. So remember again, AI, 1,500 milligrams per day for adults, which equals about 3/4 of a teaspoon, and that's not very much. When you become 51 to 70 years old, it actually goes down to 1,300 milligrams. And that's normally related back to the regulation of blood pressure. As you get older, you tend to have a higher tendency for hypertension, so we decrease your sodium intake. Unfortunately, the average American consumes about 3,300 milligrams per day, okay, which is too much. So we've got to find ways to reduce sodium in our diets. And your textbook talks about ways that you can reduce sodium in your diet. On the other hand, there are instances where we have a deficiency of sodium. We call that hyponatremia. So I put a picture up here to kind of show you what happens to the body when you do have low sodium. Signs and symptoms would be things like lethargy, headache, confusion, apprehension, seizures, and coma. Hyponatremia occurs when we have a sodium less than 135 milliequivalents per liter, either because we don't take it enough or we have excess water, increased sodium loss, things below, things like suctioning, diarrhea, again, not taking enough salt. A fluid shift, we call this third spacing. We'll talk about that in Med-Surg, again, so you can kind of get an idea how this relates to your other courses. Could be from vomiting or it could just be from diuretics. Anything that causes our salt levels to go down. On the next slide, I'll show you a picture of hypernatremia, which happens when we get too much sodium. In the previous slide, I talked about hyponatremia, so let's talk about hypernatremia or high serum sodium. I, again, am a visual person, so I want you to see this. We have something called the model, so MODEL, things that could cause your serum sodium to go high. M, medications and meals. In other words, we've taken in too much sodium. Okay. O, osmotic diuretics. D, diabetes insipidus. E, excessive water loss. Or L, just simply low water intake. Okay. All of these things, and you can refer back to each specific condition as it relates to high sodium when you get to your Med-Surg or your patho. But again, these are things that can cause you to have high serum sodium. In here, for purposes of nutrition, we'll say it's just too much salt intake. But what are you looking for in these patients? Again, signs and symptoms. Another mnemonic, fried salt. Flushed skin and fever, a low-grade fever. Maybe restless, irritable, anxious, confused. And that happens with a lot of electrolyte imbalances. I for increased blood pressure and fluid retention, which is why if you have high blood pressure, we actually recommend you decrease your salt intake. E, edema, usually it's peripheral and pitting. D, decreased urine output and dry mouth. S for flushed skin or skin flushed. A for agitation. L for low-grade fever. And T for thirst. Why would we be thirsty? Because we've had either excessive water loss or low water intake, which is causing our sodium levels to go up. So we're basically dehydrated. And then we said that the first sign of dehydration is potentially being thirsty. Again, I know that some of you are new to the nursing program. You haven't had Med-Surg or Patho. These are great resources to keep as you move on. For the purpose of this course, you want to know what your recommended intake is going to be for sodium, things that contain a lot of sodium. We're going to really link this back to mostly diet. But I do want to kind of cause you to see that there is a link between this course and nursing and your future nursing courses. Finally, with regards to sodium, it's important as a nurse, and especially for this course, to understand which foods are high in sodium. When your patient comes in and you tell them to limit the sodium in their diet, to them that means not to add salt to their foods, which is absolutely the truth. However, there's hidden sodium in foods that you don't realize is there. There's 3 different tables here that talk about foods that have high sodium levels. Anything that's canned, most of your sauces, your gravies, your lunch meats, anything that has preservatives in it is usually high in sodium. When possible, you can look for the lower sodium alternatives, but you still want to look on the back at the label to see just how much sodium is in there. Something that's not mentioned on here that people don't realize is your soft drinks. Soft drinks have a lot of sodium. So again, being aware of which types of foods are high in sodium will help you be an effective teacher when it comes to teaching your clients low sodium alternatives. The next important electrolyte is potassium, and your AI for potassium is 4,700 milligrams per day. And most Americans don't get the needed potassium every day, but they do get enough to actually serve the functions that it needs in the body. Functions of potassium are carried out in coordination with sodium, so you'll have like the sodium-potassium pump. Usually potassium will influence muscular activity. It is involved in acid-base balance, and it does have an important role in cardiac function. Again, not as important for this particular course, but just to let you know, it is a very important electrolyte in our body. So foods that are high in potassium, there are so many. Things like whole unprocessed foods, white potatoes with skin, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, bananas, oranges, uh, a lot of other fruits and vegetables, dairy products, beans. There's just a few shown on this picture, but there are a lot of them out there. So it's important to understand what foods have potassium in them so we can get the necessary amount that we need per day. But again, remember, as you're looking at these high potassium foods, you also want to make sure that you're choosing not only high potassium to supplement your diet, but those that are healthy. So for example, under the vegetables, okay, we know that potatoes are high in potassium, but maybe French fries wouldn't be the best option for someone who has cardiovascular disease because we need to avoid fried foods. So you want to look on here and help your patients choose the best source of potassium and the healthiest source. Just like our sodium, we can have low and high levels of potassium. Low levels are called hypokalemia, and that's when our serum potassium falls below 3.5. We don't normally get this simply by not taking in enough in our diet. Usually it would be a less than adequate intake along with something like a diuretic that wastes our potassium or we excrete potassium through our urine. It could be severe vomiting or diarrhea. It could also be the use of laxatives that are causing us to go to the bathroom more. Therefore, we're losing more potassium than we're taking in. It could be through NG suctioning. Whatever the reason, we want to make sure that we're watching our potassium levels. We don't normally prescribe potassium supplements unless there is no way to get it through a diet. So taking potassium supplements is not recommended unless you've had it prescribed by a doctor. Most of the time, we'll try to get you to eat foods like are on the previous slide to increase your potassium levels. Most of the time, bananas and oranges are probably the two most recommended foods when it comes to potassium supplements. But again, it depends on your patient and what their preferences are and what they're able to eat. The symptoms that you might see with low potassium, things like weakness, muscle weakness, confusion, a decreased appetite. Sometimes you might see a cardiac dysrhythmia because it does affect muscles. And if you remember, the heart is a muscle. Okay, so when it gets low, you might see that the heart rhythm changes a little bit. On the other note, we have hyperkalemia. In some cases, we can actually get toxicity with too much potassium. Normally, we don't get hyperkalemia or toxicity just by eating too much, but the body can regulate it and get rid of the potassium it doesn't need. However, normally we don't get it through we don't get it through foods, but if we take too many supplements, as long as the person's got a functioning kidney, they should be okay. When patients have kidney disease, and this is important when you have your med-surg course, if a person's got kidney disease, many times they're on a potassium or low potassium diet. But excessive potassium or hyperkalemia, you might see muscle cramps. Again, potassium affects the muscles, muscle twitches, decreases in blood pressure. One of the main things you might see is changes in your EKG. If you start seeing changes in EKG related to high potassium, we've got a problem. Again, remember that the heart is a muscle, and when potassium affects muscles, it affects the heart. So you want to be really careful about watching for hypokalemia and hyperkalemia. But then you want to go back and refer your patients back to diets that either increase their potassium, or if they're on a low potassium diet, I'll show you the next slide, we'll actually talk about foods that are low in potassium. So they can go either way when you're teaching your patients. I mentioned in the previous slide that it's not only important to know about high potassium foods, but also low potassium foods, because your patients may have to be educated on increasing or decreasing their potassium. I encourage you to take a moment to pause this video to look at this slide to see which foods are actually low in potassium. When you're ready, you may continue. The last electrolyte I want to touch on is chloride. And you probably have heard of chloride attached to sodium, your sodium chloride. But what chloride does is it assists with maintaining fluid balance inside and outside the cells, but it's also a key component in your hydrochloric acid in the stomach. So again, it helps with digestion. We recommend 2,300 milligrams per day for adults. When you hit 50 years old, it decreases to 2,000 milligrams per day. And when you get to 70, we decrease it one more time to 1,800 milligrams per day. Just like sodium and potassium, you can have a deficiency with chloride, but it's very, very rare. And it's normally related back to having a sodium deficiency because they're connected. It would be the same type of circumstances that you might have a sodium deficiency from. As far as toxicity, again, possible, but very, very rare. It would be related to, for example, dehydration, which would not only cause an imbalance with chloride, but your other electrolytes. As far as the signs and symptoms of chloride toxicity, normally your signs and symptoms of dehydration or your effects of dehydration are more severe than those of chloride. So you'll probably be treating more of the signs and symptoms of dehydration, and when you do that, your chloride balances will get back into check. But I just wanted to mention it as being part of sodium and being linked. So a lot of your effects will be linked back to your sodium levels as well. Finally, let's move into Chapter 9. I want to remind you that with Chapter 9, we're talking about energy, weight, and fitness. And for this chapter, we're focusing only on pages 166 to 186. I do want to point out that on page 166, we do talk about interpreting weight, and BMI is something you'll see quite a bit in this course. While we don't expect you to actually be able to calculate BMI, you do need to understand what BMI stands for. BMI is body mass index, and we actually calculate it by dividing your weight in kilograms by the square of the height in meters. Again, do we expect you to calculate it? Absolutely not. But you do need to understand it. And take a look at the table on page 167 in your textbook. This is kind of a good example of that table. What's missing from this particular table is that at the bottom of your table on page 167, it tells you where overweight starts and where obese starts. So when you're talking about a patient who's got a BMI of, say, 19, then they're not overweight. We start at a BMI of around 25 to start determining that your patient's overweight. By the time we get to 30, we're considering your patient obese. So when you're looking at a patient's overall nutritional status, and you start calculating BMI, it's very important to be able to understand what a number in a BMI stands for. Does it mean they're underweight? Does it mean they're normal weight? Does it mean they're overweight? or doesn't mean they're obese. So please take some time during this chapter to look up how to determine what is underweight, overweight, normal weight, and obese when it comes to a specific body mass index number. Next, chapter 9 starts looking at the functions of fat and talking about body fat. While not an appealing concept, we all have to have some body fat in our bodies to survive. Some of the functions that fat serves: it's a source of energy. It helps with absorption and transportation of fat-soluble vitamins. It's an essential part of all cell membranes. Of course, there's that padding. Okay, it protects our internal organs, but we always joke around about having extra padding, but it really is padding. It's needed for healthy nerves. It's important precursors for hormones. Brain is 60% fat, so we need fat in our diet. Of course, fat gives us a feeling of satiety. It carries flavor, so it gives you that feeling of being satisfied when you eat. It also carries fat-soluble vitamins, which we talk about later in a different chapter. I said that we do have to have fat, so there are levels that we need to keep it at, though. So, for example, 3 to 8% of the male is essential body fat. 15 to 20% is a healthy level of total body fat. Anything above 20% in a male is an unhealthy level. For females, we get a little bit more leeway. 12 to 14% is essential, while 25 to 30% is healthy. So anything above 30% body fat in a female is considered excessive or unhealthy. And this is a table from your book on page 167. As we all can probably attest to, everybody stores fat just a little bit differently. Our body has cells called adipocytes, and these are cells that have a nucleus, that have a mitochondria, they have other organelles, but these features are usually squeezed over to the side to make room to store fat. When we're born, we have a relatively small number of fat cells, or adipocytes. Over the next few years, we start developing more of them when they increase in number, which is known as hyperplasia, and in size, which is hypertrophy. The kicker is that these cells are used to store energy or fat for us to use when the body needs extra energy. But if we take in more energy than we expend, then the fat storage will go on until that fat droplet reaches its maximum size. Once it gets to its maximum size, the body will say, okay, I need more storage capacity. So it decides to make more adipocytes or more fat cells. And then the stored fat is relatively equally divided so that all the cells contain less than their maximum capacity. The body then can use that capacity to continue to expand storage as long as we keep taking in more energy or more nutrients than we're going to actually need to expend. When we lose weight or when we lose fat, whether we reduce our intake or increase physical activity or we get ill, the fat is mobilized from the adipocytes to meet the energy needs. That reduces the size of the droplet of fat, producing a smaller adipocyte, but we don't actually lose the adipocyte. That's why it's harder to lose weight. Whenever you make more fat cells, they can get bigger or smaller, but when you lose weight, the fat cells don't completely disappear. We just keep redistributing the fat amongst all the cells, so they just become smaller rather than decrease in number. If we've been extremely overweight or obese, and then we lose a lot of fat, those little fat cells can become really, really small, smaller than the cells of people who were never fat. But it does show that the adipocytes were there, so at some point we were actually overweight. Okay, so here's a question. Can we blame mom and dad for us being fat? I do encourage you to read pages 169 and 170 of your text, which talk about genetic influences on body fat. But remember, regardless of your genetic makeup, your fatness is also influenced by nutritional, psychological, economical, and social factors. It's not strictly linked to genetics. Okay. Now, there is genetics that link how your body fat is distributed. So, for example, if your mother had her fat distributed primarily in her abdomen, then likely you will have yours distributed there as well. but we can't blame genetics solely for our being overweight. There's so many other factors that play into it. So if somebody comes to you and says, well, I can't help it, I'm overweight because it's just a genetic trait, they might be more predisposed to being overweight, but those other factors, that nutritional intake and psychological and economic and social factors, are also key components that play into body weight and body fatness. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in another chapter when we have a young teenager who basically is blaming his being overweight on genetics. So we've got to be prepared to kind of talk with our patients about things that they need to realize and recommendations when it comes to either decreasing body weight or maintaining body weight and not relying on genetics. This is a great diagram on page 171 in your textbook. It's called obesogenic environments. And it talks about the factors and conditions that increase the risk of the development of obesity. And you can see as these get larger and larger, the different factors that we just talked about in our previous slide and how they relate back to the development of obesity in an individual. So take a few moments and pause it and read the different levels that affect you when it comes to developing obesity. And you'll notice that a lot of these things relate to you and our society as a whole, which is probably one reason why the US in general has become more obese in the last few decades. I think everybody in this course will relate to the fact that they've either themselves tried to lose weight or they've known somebody who's tried to lose weight. And that can be an ongoing struggle for someone. Although we cannot make ourselves into any size or shape that we want, we do have the power to change our attitudes and our behaviors if we need to, so that we can be at least satisfied with our wellness of our body composition to make ourselves healthy. One thing we have to do when it comes to weight essentials is understand that there's all kinds of diet plans that are out there. Box 9.3 on page 173 talks about different plans that are out there, different types of diets, whether it's a low-calorie diet, whether it's a formula diet, whether we use medications with our diet, whether we go to Weight Watchers, whether we go to Jenny Craig. There's so many options out there for us. But the first thing we have to understand before we go on to a weight loss or a weight management program is to understand that we have to establish a realistic goal. We need to look at ourselves and say, okay, what are our unique needs and our values, and what control do we have over our bodies? Are we going to lose 20 pounds in 1 week? Probably not. If we do, we've probably got something wrong with us. So let's be realistic, be practical, and be feasible. You've got to change behavior. If you're overweight now, your current behavior is what got you here. We can't expect to change the way we look if we don't change our behavior. We've got to choose the right behaviors for change and then establish habits that will become almost self-sustaining. We can't change it for now and lose the weight and go back to our normal ways that we were before we lost the weight, or we're going to gain the weight back. There's a teaching tool on page 175 in your textbook that talks about the principles of behavior change. take a few moments to look through that. Again, learning these types of things may be beneficial to you, but it's definitely going to be beneficial to your patients as you learn to teach them how to change their behaviors when it comes to weight loss and healthy eating. Normalize your eating, okay? We tend to eat when we're happy. We tend to eat when we're sad. We eat in social settings. Maybe you're uncomfortable with eating because maybe you're overweight and you feel guilty when you eat. We want to reclaim eating as a comfortable and natural process. Enjoy your eating. Okay, that doesn't mean to eat it to get enjoyment, but when it's time to eat, in other words, letting your hunger and your fullness guide your eating. Eat when you're hungry, stop eating when you're full. And there's strategies to getting full by eating slower. But when you do eat, enjoy it. Okay, we tend to label the foods that we like the most as being sinful or off limits, and then we long for them. Okay, for example, we know we're not supposed to have bacon. We know we're not supposed to have chocolate. But then when we know it's sinful or our guilty pleasures, then we long for them. They become a treat for us. And then when we eat them, we feel dissatisfied because we've eaten them. So strive to retrain yourself to enjoy the eating process. Strive to eat when you're hungry. Don't eat because it's time to, or because you filled your plate up and you've got to eat the whole plate. Let your hunger guide when you eat. Let your fullness stop you when it's time to stop eating. Again, we talked earlier about using food for when you're happy, when you're sad, but try to limit or minimize the use of food to meet emotional needs. We've probably seen on television or had a friend who had a bad breakup, and you turn around and she's got a gallon of ice cream in her lap and she's crying into her ice cream. She's using ice cream to help her feel better. Okay, we've got to stop using food to meet emotional needs. Okay. Eat regularly and frequently, and this is something that I think is hard, especially if you're a mother, a father, a full-time student, and you're working. But you may have heard someone tell you you've got to eat to lose weight, and that sounds contradictory, but it's actually true. Okay, our bodies have evolved so that we function best when we eat several times a day, spaced throughout the wake hours. Okay, normally we have to eat during breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's just become standard for our society. But really, when it comes to eating, we actually eat better if we eat more meals, maybe every 2 to 3 hours in smaller portions. That keeps our metabolism working on a steady pace. And I learned a long time ago from a personal experience when I started going to Weight Watchers. They would tell me you have to eat every couple of hours, and I would think, well, that's just that's crazy. I'm going to end up eating more during the day than I normally am now. I'm going to gain more weight. When I finally sat down and structured my diet where I really would eat more healthy foods more frequently during the day, I really did lose weight. Okay, it just keeps that body on a regular cycle. And then unfortunately, diet alone will not help you lose weight the right way. You've got to adopt an active lifestyle. You've got to have some type of physical exercise. Okay, it's not the end all to be all, but it is one of the factors that's going to be consistently associated with success in either losing weight and or maintaining a healthy body composition. Finally, Chapter 9 talks about fitness essentials, and that's a little different than weight essentials. With fitness essentials, we're talking about athletes and those that are involved in athletic measures. When it comes to fitness essentials, we want to talk first about physical exercise. While exercise is one of the many lifestyle factors that we can control, increased physical activity does lead to improved physical fitness and to other physiologic changes. And I refer you to box 9.9-5 on page 178 that talks about why physical activity is important and how it can help you and how you're more likely to become physically active and some types of physical activity that are best for you. Keep in mind that we all have different levels of physical activity that we can do based on our current health situation. But even persons with physically disabling conditions can benefit from moderate amounts of physical activity, depending on what they're able to do. Sometimes it can be active, sometimes it has to be passive activity. but they can still benefit from physical activity. You don't have to have strenuous physical activity to achieve health benefits. Even people who are usually inactive can improve their health by becoming moderately active on a regular basis. So we want to make sure we counsel our patients on how they themselves can become physically active based on their current status. We don't all have to get out and run a 5K in the morning. Okay, as far as food and athletic performance, physical activity and nutrition have been associated with health way back since ancient Greece. Okay, we know that what you eat will affect your physical activity. Okay, people will actively seek out certain nutrients when they're going to be involved in a competition. So physically active people of all ages and levels of competition seek out information on ways to enhance their training and achieve that competitive edge. What can they do to just be that one step more competitive than the next person? Okay. But in reality, the nutritional needs of athletes are basically no different from non-athletes, with the exception of kilocalories and fluids, because they're using more kilocalories and they're using more fluids during their physical activity. Some forms of heavy training will increase the requirements for certain nutrients. So for example, carbohydrates are important during endurance exercise. Therefore, you might have your runner, your cyclist, and your swimmer taking in more carbs, up to 60 to 70% of their total kcal intake for the day. And athletes themselves should eat at least a minimum number of servings for each group daily to meet energy needs. Depending on their body size, the level of training, some athletes may need more than the larger number of servings. So again, this all comes down to an individualized assessment. As a nurse, it's up to you to understand, or at least have a basic understanding of the nutritional needs for athletes, because they're going to be coming to you for nutritional screenings, for physical assessments, and you being able to assess their needs and maybe their increasing needs is very important. So I mentioned kilocalorie requirements. Okay, this is going to range dramatically from one person to the other because it's going to be affected by things like activity level, body size, age, and climate. Okay, body size affects your kilocalorie requirements more than any other single factor. That's just, I can remember going again to, for example, like a Weight Watchers, and they determine how many calories per day you get based on your weight. And I can remember my husband getting like twice as many as I did. I was like, well, that's just not fair. But his kilocalorie requirement was based on his weight. Same thing with athletes. Your smaller athletes may not need as many calories as your larger athletes. In some cases, you have athletes who are concerned with their appearance, and they tend to eat less to keep their body weight and percentage of body fat low. You might see this with wrestlers who want to be in a lower weight class. But we've got to be careful. Restricting these calories can have a negative impact on their health and performance. Eating less than their needed amount can leave them feeling weak, and it may lead to iron deficiencies, stress fractures, and even for women, you may have amenorrhea, which is the lack of a menstrual cycle, and osteoporosis. And we'll talk about osteoporosis in a future lesson again when we have a patient who has developed osteoporosis. On the other hand, we have athletes who have to increase their kilocalorie intake to gain weight. And sometimes that can be difficult for them as well. If you're active in your sport and you're an active athlete, too much food can cause you to feel discomfort. You feel bloated, especially if that workout or that activity takes place soon after eating. So we have to kind of look at the kilocalories and base them on our athletes and their needs. There's not a general rule for everyone. Okay, moving into water. We've talked about water earlier in this lecture about how important it is, but water is the nutrient that is the most critical to athletic performance. Without adequate water, athletic performance can suffer in less than an hour. This is why when you go to major sporting events, you see the athletes on the sidelines drinking water at every break they get. Okay. We talked about the sense of thirst being the most, or being an indicator of being dehydrated or needing water. But when it comes to an athlete, thirst is not the best indicator that they need water. Okay, the fluid needs may be greater than the thirst can actually gauge. So we've got to stress to our athletes the importance of adequate fluid intake. And if we're looking at how much water they lose during an athletic session, We want them to weigh themselves before and after the exercise. And it's best to do this in the nude so you get an accurate weight and you don't have the sweat that has accumulated in your clothing. Weigh themselves nude before and after the exercise to determine how much fluid they need to replace. 1 pound of loss equals 2 cups of water. So if you weighed 150 after you worked out, but you weighed 151 before you worked out, you've lost 1 pound. So you've lost 2 cups of water. And that's really important for them to understand for fluid replacement. But then comes the question about sports drinks. We see them advertised everywhere. You know, drink Gatorade, drink Powerade, that's what you need, that's what you need. Well, the #1 goal is to stay hydrated. Whether the athlete chooses to drink water or a sports drink is really up to them. What the body needs during activities that are less than 1 hour is just cool water. Okay, the sports drink's not going to hurt, but it's not necessary. However, if an athlete's going to participate in something that's going to last more than 90 minutes, have continuous, moderate, or heavy exercise, such as running or cycling, then they probably will benefit from a sports drink because we're looking for the carbohydrates and the electrolytes that they're also losing. So again, that's up to you. If you're going to the gym for less than an hour and you're going to be on the treadmill, water's going to be just fine. If you're going to go for longer periods, it may be best to take that sports drink to replace the carbohydrates and the electrolytes. Okay, speaking of carbohydrates, remember we talked about carbohydrates earlier and that carbohydrate stores in the body. Glycogen are limited, so remember the carbohydrate turns into glycogen. If you get low levels of muscle glycogen, you can have impaired performance. Making sure you take in carbohydrates before and during exercise will help delay the onset of fatigue and allow that athlete to compete longer. You've probably heard of carbohydrate loading. In this case, that's when the carbohydrate loading is the process of changing the type of foods eaten and adjusting the amount of training to increase glycogen stores in the muscle. And what happens then is to achieve that maximum muscle glycogen store through carbohydrate loading, athletes have to consume a high carbohydrate diet as part of their regular training program. This means up to 60 to 70% of their kilocalories should come from carbohydrates. Okay, and that could be an athlete that's taking in 3,000 kilocalories a day. But we only recommend carbohydrate loading when athletes are going to be engaged in continuous exercise, again, lasting for more than 90 minutes. Okay, there may be some benefits for less than 90 minutes, but we only recommend it for those that are lasting longer than 90 minutes because we want to have those carbohydrates to last. Okay. We'll talk about protein more in a future chapter, but I do want to mention it here about a fitness essential. There's been a lot of controversy as to whether or not whether the role of protein is as important as we say it is when it comes to athletic ability. It's been in the past, you've had athletes and coaches believing that a high protein diet supplies extra energy, enhances athletic performance, and increases muscle mass. But there's been really no evidence that shows that eating more protein than is actually needed by the body improves athletic ability. Again, you've got to get what's needed, but going over above and beyond, there's not been a lot of research that shows that that improves your athletic ability. There have been studies that show that under certain circumstances, protein can help with energy metabolism, and the body may depend on protein for a greater percentage of energy during prolonged exercise, more than 90 minutes, but that's only usually when carbohydrate intake is low. Because if you remember earlier, we said that the body uses carbs first, moves into the muscles with the protein when we run out of carbs. So if we take in enough carbs, we shouldn't need protein for prolonged exercise. Okay, so that kind of leads us back to protein and the amino acid supplements. I know you've seen when people work out or you've seen commercials on TV to take all these protein supplements and these protein shakes. It's very common practice among athletes, and promoters claim that amino acids can help build muscle, aid fat loss, provide energy, speed up muscle repair, improve endurance, etc. Others claim they're more readily digested and they're easily absorbed than the protein that's consumed in food. So the question becomes, do we really need to have our athletes taking these supplements, or can they get the protein they need from their diet? And more times than not, athletes eat more than the recommended amount of protein and get enough amino acids just from their foods alone. So when in doubt, it's actually safer and cheaper to take amino acids in your glass of milk, a turkey sandwich, or other protein-rich food than to take a supplement that's promoted over the counter. So don't get sucked in by all these protein advertisements that tell you that their protein, drink the protein, and these protein supplements are what you need to be better when it comes to fitness. They're not necessarily true. When you think of fitness, you don't necessarily think of fat, but yes, fat is something that we need. In athletic performance, carbohydrates and your fats are the major sources of your energy. Okay. The amount of fat used during exercise depends on the duration and the intensity of your exercise, the level of prior training, and the composition of your diet. Okay. When you're doing aerobic exercise, you'll actually use more fat as a source of energy. So again, we do need fat, again, only in moderation and just enough based on our activity level. Again, we need vitamins and minerals. Normally, a good balanced diet will supply enough vitamins and minerals to meet the needs of most of the athletes, and consuming more is really not showing any improved performance. So as long as you've got a good balanced diet, you're getting as much as you need. If your diet's lacking, you may decide to choose to take some type of a supplement. And the last thing, which is probably a foreign term to you, is ergogenic acids. In athletics, ergogenic acids are used to describe the drugs and dietary regimens that some believe will increase their strength, power, endurance. And if you look at table 9.8 on page 182, it talks about some of the substances that are used in ergogenic acids. Things like antioxidants, caffeine, creatinine, ginseng. And it really depends on what you believe. But for the most part, there's a lack of scientific basis for the claims associated with these products. But it's a multi-million-dollar business, and our athletes are our prime targets because they want to believe that if a little bit of this is good, then a lot is better, so they're going to take more. Taking several different types of supplements at one time, and we talk about supplements when we get to week 7, or taking a large amount of one nutrient such as a vitamin A can actually be toxic. We do run a risk of nutrient-nutrient interactions in which the excess of one nutrient can interfere with the body's ability to use another nutrient. A situation, for example, that might occur when we take an excessive amount of one amino acid, then possibly the use of another amino acid can be compromised. So when it comes to fitness, there's a lot of things that we have to consider. And every one of these categories, while there are general concepts that are crucial, we have to make sure we're looking at our individual, the type of activity, and their actual normal everyday diet before we make any recommendations for an enhanced diet or enhanced supplements for our athletes.